federal grants process to help improve communities' access to critical resources, increase transparency, reduce duplication, and streamline the federal grants process. Each year, federal agencies distribute grants to help communities fund everything from workforce training programs and disaster mitigation efforts to local fire stations and first responders. Last year, the federal government awarded over $1 trillion in federal grant money. Communities in Michigan and across the country rely on this funding for essential services and personnel to keep the public safe. Communities also count on federal grants to implement and advance groundbreaking initiatives from the American Rescue Plan Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that have helped communities recover from the pandemic, upgrade their infrastructure, and address climate change. For example, in my home state of Michigan, the city of Detroit will use federal grant funds to help restore the I-375 highway to a boulevard, knitting a divided community back together and creating new opportunities for economic development in the process. The funding the city received through a grant from the bipartisan infrastructure law will help them complete this project nearly 2 years earlier than expected. These types of grants can go a long ways towards helping communities invest in significant projects and provide critical services to their residents. However, many communities, especially small and rural communities, face barriers to accessing these vital resources. Today, we'll be examining some of those barriers and discussing what more the federal government can do to ensure that every community has the opportunity to apply for and receive grant funding. Smaller communities often lack the resources to hire grant writers or ensure compliance with complicated federal guidelines, missing out on important opportunities that could help them better serve the public. By ensuring communities have access to funding, we also can encourage the fair and efficient distribution of grants to states, to cities, to localities, as well as to organizations with the greatest need, not just those with the greatest capacity. While some agencies have successfully implemented recommendations to expand access, many stages of federal grant process remain both fragmented and duplicative. For example, more than 50 different federal agencies distribute grants to more than 131,000 recipient organizations for more than 1,900 grant programs, each with its own application and award process that can be difficult to navigate. I'm working on legislation to increase accessibility to federal grants by simplifying grant announcements and requiring announcements to use plain, easy-to-understand language. Other challenges, such as technical setbacks, a lack of leadership and coordination, and the burdensome nature of the grant application process have prevented communities from accessing federal grants. IT and technical barriers have also prevented communities and organizations from assessing grants. Many agencies use different grant management software systems, leading to confusion, to frustration, and wasted time for many applicants. Recently, the System for Award Management, or SAM.gov, the government-wide registration system for federal funding awards, experienced technical issues that adversely affected businesses and nonprofits applying for grants. Irregular funding cycles also prevent smaller cities and local governments from hiring permanent staff, and shortages of temporary staff have exacerbated an already insufficient workforce, especially in the areas of greatest need. These challenges affect organizations and governments all across our country. And in planning for this hearing today, I've heard from states, from cities, nonprofits, and tribes about the importance of having access to federal grants. Without objection, I would like to enter several statements that I have here into the record that will reflect the challenges that all of these organizations face. And while it's critical that we streamline the federal grants process to promote better access for smaller communities, we must do so in a way that ensures the federal government receives the information it needs to fairly distribute awards and to conduct appropriate oversight. As chairman, I will continue to work to address these needs and conduct oversight to help eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse within the federal government. And today I'm pleased to welcome our panel of expert witnesses who can speak to the challenges and barriers facing their communities and help share some ideas of how we can improve this federal process. It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Today, our first witness is Mr. Jeff Arkin, Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Arkin expertise includes work on the federal government and state and local fiscal issues, specifically the congressional budget process, federal agency budget formulation, fees for federal services, and grants between the federal government and state and local governments. Mr. Arkin, welcome. Welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Chairman Peters, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today to talk about grants management. Federal grants play an important role in funding our national priorities, most recently including the COVID-19 pandemic and the federal government's response to it. At the same time, federal grants represent a substantial financial commitment. In fiscal year 2022, the federal government provided about $1.2 trillion in assistance to state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and most of this was for grants. To put that amount in perspective, that assistance accounted for about 1 out of every 5 federal dollars spent that year. GAO has an extensive body of work on federal grants, and today I'm going to talk about some of the broad challenges that we've found in that work for grants, for grant recipients and grant applicants. These include capacity challenges, challenges with coordinating grant programs across the federal government, and challenges with the accuracy and completeness of information about grant programs available to Congress and to the public. In terms of capacity, there are various challenges that grant applicants and recipients can encounter. Some grant programs require a local financial commitment, and that can be a challenge for communities or local governments with limited financial resources. Human capital capacity can be another challenge. Some smaller entities that don't often receive federal funding may have less institutional knowledge or experience with the federal grant process. And this could limit smaller entities' ability to fulfill the various requirements associated with grants, such as fulfilling all the legal requirements and reporting requirements. Another type of challenge involves fragmented or overlapping grant programs. GAO's work has identified areas where there are numerous federal grants that may not be well coordinated. And this fragmentation and overlap can limit cost effectiveness and increase burden for grant recipients. One example that we found in our work is within the area of broadband access. In reviewing the range of federal broadband programs, we identified at least 133 programs, including some grant programs, that can be used to support broadband access in some way. And those programs were spread across 15 different federal agencies. This patchwork of fragmented and overlapping programs creates complexity and barriers for potential grant applicants and could lead to wasteful duplication of funding and effort. We recommended that the administration create a national broadband strategy to better synchronize these various programs. Finally, we've also seen challenges with the transparency of grant spending. A key source of information on federal spending, including on grants, is usaspending.gov, which is the federal government's public website that displays information about descriptions and data on federal spending. And this information can help with policymaking and can also help demonstrate to Congress and to the public how and where federal grant funds are spent. The federal government has made significant strides in implementing USA spending over the years. However, through various reviews, we have found some issues with the accuracy and completeness of the data and other information on USA spending. One example is the completeness of information on subrecipients. And so when a federal grant recipient passes through funds to other entities to perform a portion of the work associated with a grant award, that information is supposed to be reported in most cases. However, we've found gaps and errors with the subaward data on USAID spending. One example is our recent review of U.S. funds provided to entities in China. We were unable to provide a complete accounting of the full extent of all grant and other funding to these entities because of limitations with the completeness and accuracy of that data, of that subaward data on USAID spending. And given these and other known challenges, we're currently reviewing subaward data in USAID spending and hope to have a report on that later this year. Chairman Peters, members of the committee, that concludes my prepared statement, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Arkin. Thank you for that. Our next witness is Dr. Megan Elliott, Deputy Chief Financial Officer at the City of Detroit. Dr. Elliott oversees all public, grant, and private philanthropic dollars for Detroit. Previously, Dr. Elliott served as the Chief Parks Planner for the City of Detroit and focused on equitable access to public space citywide and special projects. I'd also like to recognize that Terry Daniels, the Director of Grants for the City of Detroit, has traveled with Dr. Elliott to be here today. Welcome. We're excited to have both of you here, as well as other representatives from the City of Detroit, and look forward to working with all of you on this important issue. Dr. Elliott, you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Chairman Peters and distinguished members of this committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today representing the City of Detroit and our approach to securing and responsibly stewarding federal grants. As the Deputy Chief Financial Officer for Detroit, I oversee the Office of Development and Grants. Typically in municipal government, grant writers and managers are seated within departments and focused on specific subject matter portfolios, for example, in parks, public safety, or workforce. In 2017, the City of Detroit decided to take a different approach. We reorganized into one centralized department serving the entire city. We have a team of grant writers who work on seeking funds for multiple departments and manage key relationships with federal, state, and local funders, which includes our philanthropic and corporate partners. We also have a team of grants managers divided into workflows of planning, implementation, compliance, and audit support. This restructuring strengthened our grants management systems, yielding a much higher success rate for applications, the ability to manage over double the fund portfolio with the same size staff, and a proportionally significant reduction in our findings over time. It also inadvertently prepared Detroit for the overlapping crises of the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating flooding that happened across our city in 2021. Given these experiences, I was asked to share recommendations for how the federal government can better support municipalities, working hard to secure and spend grant dollars. My recommendations can best be summarized as the following 3 requests: greater flexibility, clarity, and consistency. First, flexibility. The American Rescue Plan Act state and local fiscal recovery funds exemplifies what cities need most: flexibility within guardrails. ARPA SLFRF enabled Detroit to respond to the specific ways in which our city was impacted by the pandemic. In the summer of 2021, we carried out extensive community engagement throughout 65 community meetings and hundreds of resident survey responses to prioritize where and how to respond to the continuing effects of the pandemic and support our long-term economic recovery as a city. The flexibility provided by ARPA SLFRF regulations allowed us to develop a deliberative portfolio of programs, all of which are in various stages of implementation today. Greater flexibility is also needed in the way local dollars are counted toward federal match. The city contributes significant resources towards projects that we submit for major grant applications, but these dollars often do not count towards match because the grant period is defined too narrowly, and turnover of our fiscal year or the timing of a philanthropic board meeting can make all the difference. Allowing for costs incurred on a project 12 or even 6 months prior to a grant period would significantly increase our ability to participate. Our second request of this committee is greater regulatory clarity. My team spends a great deal of time determining whether to procure contracts, issue subrecipient agreements, or select beneficiaries. Even our auditors have trouble interpreting the uniform guidance when it comes to these determinations. Partner federal agencies do offer supplemental workshops and training, but there's no free training or standardized checklists offered directly by OMB on this subject. With the revisions of the uniform guidance currently underway, we believe greater clarity on this issue would dramatically reduce audit findings, as uniform guidance trainings can often be cost prohibitive and time intensive. Cities also seek greater clarity when it comes to performance management of our grants. Tracking outputs and outcomes are essential to understand the impact of our programs. However, recently a consultant partner recommended that to follow OMB best practices, we would need to conduct full program evaluations for 107 of our programs. Doing so would mean significant dollars directed towards performance measurement, often for interventions already supported by evidence, in lieu of actual direct services to Detroiters. This is a trade-off we're not willing to make. While it is important to establish best practices, when cities look to federal guidance and are focused on having both a spotless track record and the greatest impact, it is also critical to clarify minimum requirements. Lastly, we ask for greater consistency across platforms for how we communicate with our federal agency partners. As one example, in our office alone, we work with 13 different federal portals, 3 of which are FEMA, as well as 10 state portals that serve as a pass-through. Each portal has different authorization and user requirements, different regulations for document retention, and different staff to contact when a system crashes, as they consistently do, even up to a full week before reporting and application deadlines. Consolidation of these portals would allow for one platform with robust cybersecurity and bandwidth, and a significant decrease in the workload of our grants managers. Thank you for allowing the time for these humble recommendations. It has been a privilege to speak before you today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Dr. Elliott. Today's final witness is Mr. Matthew Hansen, Associate Managing Director at Witt O'Brien's, a management consulting firm that specializes in crisis and emergency management. In his role, he supports state and local governments as they apply for and manage federal grants. Previously, he served as Arizona's statewide grants administrator and as a director of the Grants Policy Office at the Department of Justice. Mr. Hansen, welcome to our committee. You may proceed with your opening remarks.
Chairman Peters and distinguished members of this committee, during my almost 30-year career, I've had the honor of supporting life cycle grants management activities for federal, tribal, state, local, and non-governmental organizations. Over my career, I've heard the terms once in a generation and historic amounts of federal funding at least 5 times. The first was during the early 90s with the crime bill, and most recently with the COVID-19 and infrastructure funding. Despite the vast differences in these events, there was at least one commonality. Federal funding deployment was slow due to a lack of public sector capacity. Recent efforts to distribute critical funding more equitably have unfortunately spotlighted this lack of basic grants management capacity. That was especially the case with Treasury's distribution of ARPA fiscal recovery funds. In Senator Marshall's state of Kansas, more than 600 non-entitlement units of local government have been the direct recipients of federal funds, most for the very first time. Some of these jurisdictions only have a few dozen residents and a single employee. This is not a criticism of the distribution to NEUs, but an opportunity to underscore the point that we collectively need to do a better job of building grants management capacity across our country, while redoubling our efforts to streamline and simplify the process. For the past several years, I've had countless conversations with local and tribal governments about seemingly mundane projects like replenishing gravel roads, culvert restoration, ADA sidewalks, wastewater lagoons, and any number of similar types of basic infrastructure. These same jurisdictions are the communities that lack the resources and capacity to tap into federal funding, either directly or as pass-through recipients from their states. The annual State of Grants Management Survey found that 70% of organizations said that qualified staff is the most significant success factor for grants management, and 54% said recruiting, training, and retaining them is the biggest challenge. The survey further found that both grant makers and grant recipients want more standardization and simplification. What is so interesting about these results is the survey participants are those who actually have grant staff. So these are the jurisdictions who, in theory, have the tools and capacity to be successful, and yet they are still struggling. The current obstacles to accessing federal funding begin with the very first step, registering in the system for award management. It is likely that your own offices have received numerous complaints and requests for assistance with SAM.gov. When things like copies of the state's constitution are being requested to prove when the state was established, you can imagine what an under-resourced community must overcome. Other federal efforts to simplify and streamline the federal grants process, the uniform guidance, grants.gov, FAFATA reporting, the data and GRADE Acts are all well-intentioned and have the potential to help. The issue remains that federal agencies have implemented these items in very different ways, and that these efforts do not address the underlying barriers to entry to participate in the federal grants ecosystem. Now for some good news. There are organizations out there doing incredible work trying to build grants capacity to ensure no jurisdiction is left behind. Much of this work is being done by membership associations, such as the National Association of Counties and the National League of Cities, among other organizations. Much of this effort is being supported by philanthropic organizations who have seen these same issues and have felt compelled to help communities overcome barriers to entry and participation. In recent years, resources like Bloomberg's Federal Assistance E311 and Local Infrastructure Hub have provided critical technical support to over 1,000 municipalities nationwide. What these organizations and the federal grants community as a whole need is partnership and a commitment to bring lasting systemic change to federal grants by simplifying the process and creating an intentional and sustained effort to build capacity at all levels. Some areas for consideration are address the ongoing issues with SAM.gov, renew the focus on federal plain English standards, and reestablish a federal grants coordinating organization. Finally, we have seen numerous examples of waste, fraud, and abuse, which as stewards of taxpayer resources is completely unacceptable. Solving these issues will take the ongoing efforts of the compliance and oversight communities on the post-award side. But my ask of this committee is to also address these issues on the pre-award side by investing in streamlining, coordination, communication, and fundamental grants management capacity. Thank you again for this opportunity to address the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Hansen. So my first question will go to Dr. Elliott and then Mr. Hansen. After Dr. Elliott has given her response, if you'd like to add your thoughts, we'd appreciate that as well. Both of you in your testimony mentioned how duplication and lack of consistency in administering the federal government's 1,900 grant programs causes issues. We know that notices of funding opportunities and rules for managing grants can vary, sometimes substantially from program to program. So I'd like you to tell this committee, kind of dive in a little bit deeper and tell this committee why that provides some real challenges to your office or to the folks that you work with. Dr. Elliott, if you want to take the first crack at that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator. So certainly any inconsistencies can be a tremendous challenge for our office. I would say that one of the best examples I could give would be in relation to how different agencies interpret uniform guidance and make exceptions or amendments to the uniform guidance, and the differences that can happen across agencies when that happens, especially if you're blending and braiding funds together to make a more transformational impact. So one example I think of all the time is in relation to our affordable housing program in Detroit. So we've used funds from HUD, which allow for an exemption to the competitive award process for subrecipients, and that's allowable under HUD. However, we have the exact same affordable housing program where we're using SLFRF dollars, where that direct award to subrecipients is not allowable. So we've gone through a competitive process for those, but the general confusion that created for our staff and team on the front end to clarify, to make sure that we were interpreting correctly, and to go back and forth between the housing and grants management teams took a significant amount of time and effort, and then in deploying those funds. So I think, if to my colleagues' comments, if it's difficult to interpret for a professional grants management organization in a major American city, I can only imagine how challenging that would be to smaller municipalities or our subrecipient counterparts.
Thank you. Mr. Hansen?
So the current ARPA funding, the state and local fiscal recovery funding, at last count had over 90 individual guidance documents issued. As you can imagine, trying to keep track of what the current set of rules are, what you can fund, what you can't fund, is a Herculean task. I'll take a step back, though, and talk about the notices of funding availability or funding opportunity. Grants.gov is a wonderful solution. It's the front door for the federal grants process. The problem is when you pull up a funding opportunity in grants.gov and you're faced with a 70-page notice of funding availability, and it takes you 3.5 hours to even figure out if you're eligible for the program or not. And that's really where some of the improvements need to start, is breaking those notices of funding availability down into plain English, things that people can truly understand, and not spend hours of staff time only to figure out that you're ineligible from applying. So, yes, there's a lot of areas for improvement post-award on the compliance and guidance documents, but it really starts with the very first step, which is figuring out if you can even apply for a grant or not.
Well, Mr. Hanson, this is something that drives me crazy, especially given what you're saying about how complicated this is and how it's difficult for particularly rural areas or smaller communities to do it. But we have heard that agencies like to give grants to applicants that have successfully received a grant. So unless you've already received a grant, it's really hard to get a grant, which makes no sense because those communities that haven't received a grant are probably oftentimes in the greatest need for those grants. So my question for you, Mr. Hanson, is how would you priorities? What should the federal government be doing right now to make sure that we're reaching high-need communities, even if those communities haven't had the experience of getting a grant because of the complexity of getting the grant in the first place? How would you prioritize some action items that this committee should be considering in that area?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And it really is fundamental grants management capacity development. There are, not only the philanthropic organizations I mentioned who are out there doing wonderful work, but even organizations like the Appalachian Regional Commission and others who are really committed to building grants management capacity. Historically, federal agencies do a wonderful job of training and technical assistance of their grantees. They have wonderful relationships, wraparound services, but what's really missing is the future applicant, the city out there, the nonprofit out there who, needs the funding, has the critical resources, and there's nobody out there really providing generic grants management capacity development. And I really think if the federal agencies, many of the programs receive technical assistance funding with their programs. If part of that training and technical assistance money was invested in just generic Grants 101 building grants management capacity would really help. We see, especially with the non-entitlement units of local government, they don't know where to start. They don't know the terminology. They don't know, you talk about the federal uniform guidance or 2 CFR 200, and you're speaking another language, and it shouldn't be that way. So we really need to take a step back and invest in fundamental training and grants management development to make sure that our underserved communities, our under-resourced communities, both rural and urban, are not left behind with all the funding that's out there right now.
Great, thank you. Mr. Arkin, in your testimony, you highlighted the importance of collaboration, coordination, and information sharing across all these agencies that are awarding these grants. Would you discuss for the committee the current state of coordination efforts as you see it across the federal government, and what can we do to improve that coordination if you say that there are some shortfalls?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Coordination is a challenge. There are a lot of different grant programs in any given area, and sometimes it can be hard to know, do those programs really overlap? Are they just fragmented? Do they have distinct purposes? And so that's really a first step, just figuring that out, making sure agencies are talking to one another, to coordinating, to meeting regularly, and to sharing information to understand what they can do to remove any burdens that are there for recipients when you do have that overlap or possible fragmentation, which can be difficult to manage.
Is there a mechanism to do that now?
There's not a set structure necessarily. I think it's dependent on the particular area. So for the broadband example I mentioned, there is discussion among some of the agencies, but there's no overarching structure or strategy that the federal government, that the administration has to try to synchronize all of those programs.
What would that look like if we were going to do that?
Well, we've recommended that the administration develop a national strategy. What we've heard in the response is that they're considering it. There have been some discussions and working groups, but we haven't seen an actual strategy that lays out how these 15 different federal agencies should be coordinating to make sure that there isn't potential waste of funds, that there isn't duplication of effort, and that these different programs are synchronized to the extent that they can be.
Thank you. Senator Langford, recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thanks for holding this hearing as well. It's incredibly important. Let me just set context for this to be able to walk through. We have 51 federal agencies that distribute grants, 131,000 recipient organizations. 1,900 grant programs in the federal government, and in fiscal year 22, the federal government spent over $1 trillion in taxpayer dollars in grants. So this is an incredibly large, incredibly complicated issue, and as Mr. Hansen just mentioned before, if you're a small town and you know that big towns get grants for water systems and for roads and whatever it may be, they think I have no idea where to even go to get it. And so I do appreciate us having the hearing and be able to walk through this and where the issues are. Mr. Arkin, let me start with 2019. Let's go back to ancient history, pre-COVID, if we have memory of that time period, of a bill called the GREAT Act that passed. I carried that through the Senate. Virginia Fox carried that through the House. It was supposed to synchronize some of the data systems. How's OMB doing at this point in actually implementing the GREAT Act? What's the status of a bill that was done 4 years ago?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And we actually have work underway looking at the GREAT Act, and we're looking at just that question. What is the status of OMB and also HHS as the largest grant-making agency to implement the program? How does that align with the law and what the requirements are? And also, how are both OMB and HHS engaging stakeholders, engaging other agencies, local communities, states, as they develop the standards?
So what are you seeing so far? Obviously, this was passed 4 years ago. What are you seeing as far as implementation and creating the standards?
Right, and so the final deadline for when all this is supposed to be in place is at the end of 2023, this fiscal year, and so it's getting close. We continue to have conversations with OMB about the steps that they've taken. There are an initial set of, I believe, over 500 different data standards that they've developed. We're going to be looking at those. We're going to be seeing how those align with the intent of the GREAT Act, and also talking with others about their reaction to those standards that have been developed.
Okay, we'll look forward. Thanks for the oversight on that. We'll look forward to walking through that to make that clearer. There's been a lot of conversation about faith-based entities as well, if they're equal partners with every other entity. What are you seeing as far as oversight right now on faith-based entities requesting an application for a grant, not to increase their faith, but for social services, other things that are actually happening out there? This seems to have had a rise and fall over the last several years of whether faith-based entities are full participants with everyone else in this. Are you seeing anything rise on this? Because the Biden administration has noted they're going to relook at this issue again.
It's not something that we have looked at in our work. Certainly something that we'd be happy to talk to you or your staff about to get more, to understand your interests a little bit better and see if there's ways that we can support and looking into that.
Be great. Thank you. Let me bounce a couple things on you just on grants.gov. Sure. Mr. Hansen mentioned before the complexity of actually reading through the language. Sometimes it's 70 pages of government legalese to be able to go through, and the difficulty of finding if you're even eligible for this. Obviously, that's something that can be done, can be standardized. Every single agency can have just simple plain text language at the beginning of it saying, here's who's eligible and here's who's not eligible, here's when it's available and here's when it closes. They're trying to get some of those elements in there, but it's certainly not clear at this point, to be able to say the least. And there's still some issues. While grants.gov is a very helpful site and the search features all work well, anyone who spends a little bit of time playing with grants.gov and just typing in different search words will find some gaps in the system. I would encourage anyone to be able to go in. For instance, I was playing with different words on it this morning and typed in the word watermelon. As a watermelon fan, I want to see if there's watermelon grants out there. What pops up when you type in watermelon into the search in grants.gov is a grant opportunity for the U.S.-Egypt education program to help Egyptian children increase their math skills. How that's connected to watermelon, I couldn't discover on it, but we still have issues with the system and the way that it's actually broken out. So I'd encourage just in the oversight on this to continue to be able to work towards getting consistent language, common sense language, the way that's actually to be able to be listed in there that makes sense to people. And if anyone can find the word watermelon in the Egypt grant for children learning math in Egypt, that would be helpful. And the second question will be, why are we giving a grant to help Egyptian children learn math? We have a few math problems here as well. Second thing on this is just the fragmentation that continues to be able to come up. This is an issue that we worked through just in Oklahoma in a grant opportunity. I need to make sure I get the language right. We had a challenge in actually listing out for a grant that they couldn't find us in the process because we appeared in the system as State Department of Education rather than the Education, Oklahoma Department of. So our folks spent days trying to be able to unwind that one thing to be able to get it in the system. That's an area that we appreciate any kind of insight. Mr. Arkin, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, in general, that's been a big challenge, consistent language that gets used in the grant landscape. That's something that we've found in our work before with things talking about, the type of award. And it affects both up front in terms of recipients looking for funding. It affects the transparency aspect as well in terms of getting a handle on where did the money go, what type of program, where did it, what location. When you have inconsistent terms, that gets much harder to do. And so we've made recommendations to OMB to improve guidance to agencies so they can help. And we continue to monitor the status of that and OMB's efforts to implement those recommendations.
Okay, we'll follow up on that. That'd be helpful. Sure. The one last question is one not that you can really offer, but it's one that I'll lay before this committee as an issue that we need to have ongoing oversight, and it's the question of what grants do we fund? We have $31 trillion in total debt. I think everyone on this dais is very, very aware of that. The challenge is we're still having problems in the grant funding going out. As we just start pulling the thread on grant funding that's out there, we recently found a grant for a study for medieval Renaissance studies that is going to be conducting a conference in San Antonio. And the conference, and it's a federal grant, to recreate the works of Shakespeare in a new cultural praxis in decolonizing the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. That's a federal grant. And if we haven't had enough Shakespeare on that, we have a different grant that is actually out there that's a federal grant to create a virtual reality for Shakespeare so that you could put on the VR glasses and then you would think that you're in a Shakespearean theater interacting with other individuals. Now, again, Meta is doing this on a large scale while we have a federal grant to be able to create this system. I don't know. We have another grant that's out there that has given to do a study of the cultural meaning of sound in colonial Mexico. I could go on with just a quick pull of the thread on some of the grant issues. We do have a larger issue on grants, and with $1 trillion in grant spending, we need to determine what is a water system in a community that desperately needs help for a water system, and what is a grant that's going to do a study of sound in colonial Mexico, and how do we figure out how to be able to prioritize those two. So that's a larger conversation we need to have in the days ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
There it is. My sound's on. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. And I want to agree with Senator Langford on the complexity of applying for grants and IT modernization. What he's talking about in these search strings and all of this, we need systems that are nimble, that are able to do this, and good common front ends. They are so complex. We have to make it more user-friendly. We can make it more searchable to access the programs that we need to and find the ones that maybe aren't being utilized because people can't actually find it or apply for it. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, because these barriers for Nevada as well, accessing our federal grants. So despite making significant improvements over the past half of a decade, the state of Nevada continues to underperform in total dollars of federal grants per capita. We're ranked 45th in the nation. And so the Nevada Advisory Council on Federal Assistance has published priorities for addressing these perennial barriers, some of which Senator Langford alluded to. We want to obtain and maximize our federal grants, including streamlining the review and authorization process for grant work plans by the state's Interim Finance Committee. We want to expand our technical assistance, training, and coordination related to receiving these federal grants, and increasing statewide reporting. And so to address these recommendations and increase the amount of grant dollars coming to Nevada, last year our state created the Governor's Office of Federal Assistance. So, Mr. Hansen, What steps should Nevada's newly launched OFA, and I'm sure other states could probably use this advice as well, what should we take to be an effective resource so that grant applicants, particularly in our rural areas, they have smaller infrastructure for them to apply for these grants, that they're aware of the services that it provides and they can access it easily, nimbly, that watermelon may not show up where it should only show up where it's actually there, and utilize it to secure the federal funding that we do work so hard to provide for our public projects.
Thank you, Senator. And I just want to mention you have some really wonderful staff. Standing up that office, I had the pleasure of working with many of them when I was with the state of Arizona. Too often, state agencies in a similar capacity are inward-looking. They're focused on how the state agencies can, more effectively apply for and receive funding. And while that's important, the larger issue and the issue you just discussed is the outward facing. How do you help the local governments, the nonprofits, the K-12 institutions in your state? And it starts with, grants training. It starts with meaningful, not 1 hour webinars, here's what a program is about, but really digging deep. How do you build, internal controls? How do you, put together a capital stack? A concept of a capital stack is how do you take general fund, bond proceeds, grant funds, Inflation Reduction Act, tax credits, and bundle them together so that you can actually accomplish a project. For a smaller municipality with limited capacity, that's a very foreign concept, but the reality is they're not going to be successful going forward unless they understand concepts like that. So really doing, one-on-one training, capacity development, and doing, when you're doing training, it's homework, and I hate to make it sound like
Right.
school, but it's homework. So your homework today is to go register with grants.gov. It's to
So you recently helped Arizona do this. Can you talk about what you did to boost up Arizona so we could take some of those lessons back to our state?
So one of the first things we did with the state of Arizona was tried to solve our own state problem. So previously, if you were a local government and you were trying to find the funding opportunities available from the state, you had to go to 23 separate state agency websites to see who had what funding, available. So the first step we did was we put it all on one spot, one, sort of a state version of grants.gov. So our local governments only had to go to one website. We took the notices of funding availability and we distilled them down with a partner into a 4-page, readable, plain English. This is the.
So I should have my Nevada folks talk to the Arizona folks. And
there are some real leaders across the country in Rhode Island, Indiana, Maryland, Ohio, Arizona. Certainly there's some people who are really doing some wonderful work in this space and could certainly be resources.
We will have them reach out. And I want to move on and talk to Mr. Arkin a little bit, because in FY 2020, the project grants per capita in Nevada amounted to $342 per capita for a ranking of 43rd in the nation. It was 36% lower than the U.S. average of $493 per person and over a quarter lower than the median state, which happens to be Mississippi, which has a population size that is very similar to Nevada. So, Mr. Arkin, what can Congress do to support our states? Again, we've got to find ways to ease these barriers that are keeping some of us at the back of the pack. We've just spoken a little bit about that. There's been significant issues with SAM.gov system, how we compete competitively. Do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, one way that Congress has already taken at least one step that could help in this area is with the GREAT Act, as that we discussed earlier, and really help standardize some of the language that should make it easier for applicants, in particular applicants who may be applying for multiple grants, to use the same language, to potentially use pre-populated information to reduce some of that burden. And part of it also comes down to awareness. As a person whose name is on the GAO website, who works on grant issues, I get phone calls from people who work in city government with small cities who just want to know, how do I find out about grants? And so even just anecdotally, it's clear, to me at least, that there are challenges there. And so that's not something that we've done a lot of work on before. We usually have been looking at what is the process for managing grants that are already in the system. And so it is a challenge.
Well, I have a person specifically on my team that is their portfolio to manage grants in Nevada. I'm going to take I'll submit this next question for the record, but it's about tribal communities and their access. Well, I think there might be some other folks coming, so that's fine. Oh, okay, well then I will ask the last question then, thank you. The grants for tribal communities. We have 28 tribes in Nevada, and I've heard from all of them about the challenges they face, again, the capacity that they have in order to apply for these, the complexity. Oftentimes, tribes have been historically underserved through federal grant programs. Thankfully, with the enactment of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we've made historic investments in Indian country. We're going to improve the internet access, some of the ways that will help them get through to these things. But the funding opportunities are only going to make a difference if the federal agencies are engaged. So, Mr. Arkin, GAO, you've issued several reports outlining the actions that the federal government must take to improve how they share information with grants, for our federal grants with tribes. How can you improve the communication there? Again, sometimes some of our tribes are still waiting to get good internet access. So how are you doing the outreach to be sure that they get the funding that they deserve to improve whatever it is right for them?
Sure, happy to talk about that. As you mentioned, we have a couple of reports that we've issued on that particular area. One example we found was in the economic development area, where we found over 20 different grant programs that were either targeted
so
or...
You issue the reports, but then what is the action item that you're taking after to outreach? Because having a stack of reports isn't helping our Indian country. It isn't helping our tribal communities. They can go through your stack and say, oh, we haven't done good enough. What are you going to do about? What's the action items you're taking?
So what we found is that the agencies weren't making available the information so that the tribal communities would know about the grants. We made recommendations for the agencies, and this is USDA and SBA, to maintain a list of this information so they could communicate it to the tribal entities so they're even aware of the grants and can apply for them. And we continue to follow up on the progress in implementing that recommendation.
Well, I hope we do ask for a lot of reports, but they don't do anyone any good if the action items aren't followed up on. And so you're going to tell SBA or USDA, we want to be sure that then they follow up on what they're doing, because it just gets lost in a long chain of reports. We passed something wonderful like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, to invest in our communities, and those reports of action items that aren't followed up on and aren't taken seriously hurt our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to our panelists. Mr. Arkin, I'd like to begin with a discussion of the particular needs of rural communities in Georgia. I hear so frequently from county chairs, commissioners, mayors of small rural localities that they have such difficulty applying for and securing federal grants. They, in many cases, don't have the financial resources or the full-time staff power to have the situational awareness about funds that are available and the capacity to write these grant proposals and compete for the funds. And of course, my office, we do everything that we can to ensure they're aware of these opportunities and to help guide them through the process. But there are also steps that the administration could take to ease the path to success, to meet unmet needs in water infrastructure, broadband access, public safety, healthcare, first responders. So from your position at GAO and recognizing you're a ledge branch actor, what recommendations do you have for steps the Biden administration could take right now to ensure that rural communities can access their fair share of these opportunities through the infrastructure law and other federal grant programs?
Well, one recent initiative that the administration's taken is known as the Rural Partners Network. It's relatively new. It's a group of federal agencies. There are a number of states that participate. And one of the key goals of that is to highlight grants, to highlight opportunities within rural communities. It's not something that we have really looked into, again, because it's quite new, but it's something we're following and would be happy to discuss with you. There's also the technical assistance aspect to it. Most of what we have done on technical assistance involves assistance that agencies provide to entities or governments who've already received grants in terms of implementing the grant, following the various requirements, especially the reporting requirements, the audit requirements. We haven't really looked at the upfront part of that, what can be done with technical assistance to help entities, to help small governments even understand what grants are available to them that could help their communities.
I think that's could be a very fruitful area for additional analysis, and I'll follow up with you and your team about trying to get some more recommendations that the federal government can take, but also best practices and advice for these rural communities who want to be aware of the opportunities available to them and effectively compete for this funding. Let's talk about some of the unique challenges faced by predominantly black communities in Georgia and across the country. A concern that I hear frequently from elected leaders, faith leaders, business leaders, civic leaders, whether in DeKalb County, Clayton County, Chatham County, is a sense that in these predominantly black communities there is not sufficient outreach by federal agencies, not sufficient efforts to ensure that grant programs that can address the particular needs of these communities. For example, in Georgia there is a maternal health crisis that in particular impacts black women, that those opportunities are not communicated effectively enough. What steps could the administration or Congress take in order to ensure that there is equitable awareness and access of these grant opportunities that would be of particular interest to predominantly black communities?
I think to some extent the answer to that's similar to the one that we just discussed in terms of what can agencies do on the technical assistance side up front. My understanding is the administration put out guidance, in particular with funding under the American Rescue Plan Act, to look at equity or to encourage agencies to provide funding in a way that's at least considers equity. That's another area as we conduct a lot of work on the American Rescue Plan Act and other COVID-related funding that we are planning on looking into.
What I would suggest you might look into is how could an administration assess what the likely most urgent needs are for a given constituency or community? If it is known that a particular part of Georgia has a maternal health crisis, or if small businesses in a particular part of Georgia lack access to capital, how can an administration be proactive about making local leaders aware of opportunities to address those specific issues? Let's talk a little bit about language access. Through the appropriations process, I recently helped to fund an extraordinary organization called Ser Familia in Georgia, which serves Latino families. They're standing up a new family resource center in Clayton County. What steps are currently being taken that you're aware of, either by us in Congress that you've tracked, by the administration at present, and what opportunities are there to expand opportunities for predominantly Latino-serving nonprofits to compete for federal grants where there may be language access barriers to awareness of the grant opportunities and pursuit of the funds?
So offhand, I'm not aware of anything there, but we can get back to you and take a look and see what we can find on that.
Yeah, I'd like you to take a look at this because there are, in some cases, urgent public health, public safety, small business-related needs in Latino communities, and these are Americans who may be denied their fair share of federal grant funding because the nonprofits that serve these communities may operate predominantly in Spanish. And so language access for competitive federal grant programs is something that I think warrants some more attention from GAO. Finally, I just want to discuss the challenges that many communities in Georgia are facing with respect to railroad crossing grants, in particular smaller communities, whether Garden City in coastal Georgia, Griffin, McDonough, Juliet. Georgians are increasingly finding themselves stuck at railroad crossings for outrageous periods of time. And this is not just a matter of convenience, it can be a matter of life or death. You got a delivering mother in labor who needs to get to the hospital, and an hour-and-a-half delay at a railroad crossing impairs that. That can be a matter of life or death or the health of the baby. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we in Congress established the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program, which is a grant program to help localities, for example, pursue track relocation, improvement or installation of protective devices, signals, and signs What steps can we take, Mr. Arkin, to ensure that smaller communities like Griffin, Juliet, Garden City, McDonough in Georgia are set up to succeed when they apply for these funds?
So that's another program. I'm not familiar with the specifics of that one, but we could get back to you and take a look and see what we can find.
Why don't you take a stab at it? Consider other programs like this one, opportunities for local jurisdictions to make improvements to their transportation infrastructure to address urgent matters, not just of convenience, but of public health and public safety.
Sure.
What advice do you have for small localities who seek opportunities such as this one?
I think it comes down to some extent, outreach from the agencies to ensure that the communities are aware that these grants are out there. It's hard to apply for a grant if you don't know it's there. And as I mentioned before, I hear these calls or emails from people who want to know, and the Infrastructure Act is an example of that. How do I apply for grant funding in the transportation area that can affect, that my small community can take advantage of or apply for? And I think outreach and communication from the agencies is a big part of that.
I appreciate your answers. I always appreciate GAO's work, and my office works hard to make these localities aware of these opportunities. What's coming out of this discussion that maybe we can pursue together is I think there are ripe opportunities for GAO to study successes and failures. And you can look at communities in Georgia that have tried to compete for federal funds but not had the wherewithal, resources, or forward guidance to do so successfully, and others that have won these federal funds, and we can work together to improve guidance for local communities, for congressional offices who have a role to play, and federal agencies to improve outreach and accessibility for these programs. So let's work together on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Dr. Elliott, this question's for you. We know that the federal government uses over 190 different grants management software systems. That's a lot of software systems. Could you tell this committee about some of the problems that your office faces when you have so many different software portals that you have to keep track of and have some degree of expertise on?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Yes, we have a robust system of tracking. The authorization requirements are significant for each of these systems. So myself and Ms. Daniels, who's here with me today, we are typically the only or one of a small number of authorized users that can sometimes be a bottleneck for some of the processes that we need to upload for reports or applications. I mentioned previously the crashing of those systems and how significant that's been. I think that that's something I wouldn't bring up in front of this committee unless it was very, very important to us. It happens all the time, and it's something that is pretty demoralizing for the team when you can spend an entire workday, trying to submit something and then the whole thing falls apart in the last minute. And again, our team has established a process of submitting for reports and applications a week prior to the deadline to try and avoid that, and it still happens. So all of this kind of inconsistency has been challenging to us. And I would say we have a significant amount of grants managers and folks that are very familiar with these portals, that have relationships with our federal agency partners, that can call them directly, and we still have these challenges. So for other communities that don't have that same kind of access, it can be even more challenging.
Thank you. Also, Dr. Elliott, in your testimony, you told us that the city of Detroit took special care to give subawards to organizations that had never received grant money before. If you could tell the committee about how the city does that, what are some of the barriers that you're attempting to overcome to allow this to move forward, and how we may learn from that example in terms of our thinking about how we improve the system.
Thank you, Chairman, for that question. This is something that we are very passionate about. So we have heard feedback from small nonprofits and small businesses across the city that basically it's hard enough for them to work with city government in the first place. They don't want anything to do with federal grants, which is really disheartening because there's so many opportunities to work together on these programs and either be the vendor that delivers the roof repair or the nonprofit that helps support our local kind of workforce programs. So What we've done specifically is we've partnered with third-party entities that basically serve as trusted local navigators. So they seek out the folks that might be interested in applying for these opportunities, whether it's through, again, a contract that's out to bid or through a subrecipient opportunity that we issue. And what those third-party entities do, and I should say we have no financial relationship with them whatsoever. They're funded philanthropically. But what they do is they serve as that central navigator. They take in folks and they truly handhold with them the entire, every step of the process. So how do I register for the system to even submit a bid to the city? What does that look like? All the way through what is good documentation retention policies? How do I submit invoices that are going to be compliant for a lot of these these federal funds? So that's something that we've developed both, again, for the small business sector locally, but then also for the nonprofit sector. We work with a couple different groups, and it's something we're really passionate about and would love to share with others who are looking to develop the same type of program.
Wonderful. So my last question is going to be to all three of you. I'll probably start with Mr. Arkin. We'll work down to Mr. Hansen here. As we've heard a lot here today, and there's a lot more that we need to hear in the days, weeks, and months ahead. But I always like to leave with a takeaway as to what you think should be the biggest takeaway that my committee gets from this hearing. So I'd like each of you to tell me what you think is the most important thing that this committee should learn from the testimony that you gave today. What are some of the action steps that we should take to help this process? But similar to the question I asked earlier about Mr. Hansen, how do we prioritize? So what should be our major takeaway? If you were sitting on this committee and you had to prioritize something to really focus on, what would that be? Mr. Arkin.
Yeah, I think one thing to think about, and we talked a lot about, is sort of the upfront knowledge on the availability of grants. It's not something, again, where we've done a lot of work, and we are happy to continue our discussions with the committee to look into what we can do to support it. But that, for me, is a big takeaway.
Great. Dr. Elliott.
Thank you, Senator. For me, I think centrally coordinating grants management is really critical to every team that we work with in the city, and I can see that being a big challenge across the country. So greater clarity and simplicity around how to deploy these dollars, strong definitions for beneficiaries and how we define quasi-governmental entities would make a massive time difference in how we're able to get these dollars quicker to our communities, and it would create that more robust network of small businesses and nonprofits that we can work with.
Thank you. Mr. Hansen?
Leverage and learn from the projects that are going on right now outside of the federal government. So the Senator asked about how we can support Native American communities. The Native American Finance Officers Association has a grants training program at the University of New Mexico doing wonderful work. The other senator asked about the railway crossing program. The National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors, Results for America, Bloomberg, and other philanthropic organizations have their local infrastructure hub where they're actually taking those small communities through an 8-module course to get them prepared to go after that program. There are states standing up their own grant capacity development activities, local infrastructure hubs. So there's some really wonderful things going on outside the federal space that the federal agencies could really support and lean on and leverage to really improve the grants management ecosystem right now.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each of our witnesses for joining us here today. And I'm certainly grateful to your contribution to this discussion. We'll look forward to continuing to have this discussion, perhaps not in a formalized way as we are here in the hearing, but clearly something that we are very focused on as a committee. Federal grants help communities in Michigan and across the country deliver key services like strengthening infrastructure, supporting first responders, building broadband systems, mitigating natural disasters. And I think today's hearing has made clear that the federal government can do more to help all of our communities to access as well as to manage the federal grants that they receive. Too often the burdens created by the federal government's lack of coordination and consistency fall on smaller and less resourced communities. These are communities that oftentimes can benefit the most from grants. So reducing the complexity of the federal grants process will increase access to these important resources, as well as promote the responsible use of taxpayer money. As chairman of this committee, I'll work with my colleagues to streamline the grants process across the federal government. Your testimony today will help inform the committee's future legislative activities and oversight action on these issues, and we look forward to have a continuing dialogue with the three of you. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on May 17th, 2023. For the submission of statements and questions for the record, this hearing is now adjourned.